My wife is Lebanese. She came to the U.S. for a master's degree at Trinity International Universities, where we met. And when we met, Joelle was committed to two things. First, she was not going to marry an American. And second, she was going back to Lebanon. Well, we've been married for 25 years, so the first part didn't really work out. But about 6 months after our wedding, I remember it well, we were living in San Diego, and I was heading back to our apartment. And I had this strong sense from God that He was leading us together to move to Lebanon. And I thought to myself, Bill, be like Ruth. Go, let her people become your people. So I went, I learned Arabic, I completed a master's degree in Middle Eastern studies, I made intentional decisions about how I lived, and I spent 17 years trying to fit in. But the truth is, in Beirut, I was always Bill the American. It didn't matter how well I spoke Arabic. It didn't matter how much I knew about the region's culture and history. Joelle's people never accepted me as one of their own. I never belonged. And so even to this day, when I speak Arabic, or I talk about Lebanese politics, or I make some comment about U.S. culture, my kids, my own flesh and blood, they tease me. And they say, Baba, you're such a wannabe Arab. They have the blood, but I'm trying way too hard to be Lebanese, apparently. So I was curious when Pastor Mitch invited me to preach in this series on belonging and told me we'd be studying the story of Ruth the Moabite. Ruth, the woman whose actual claim to fame is that she was an outsider, a Moabite who, according to the world, does not belong in the lineage of Jesus. But in rereading the story of Ruth the Moabite as Bill the American, I've been challenged to rethink what it means to foster belonging here at Wellspring and more broadly in the family of God. And I've come to believe that fostering real belonging comes down to two things. We need to be a community that knows the desperation of Ruth, and a community committed to living out the redemptive action of Boaz. We're going to focus on Boaz this morning, but before we get there, I want to touch on the first part of fostering belonging, being a community that knows the desperation of Ruth. The organization I work with, which Pastor Mitch mentioned, partners with marginalized and vulnerable people around the world to help individuals and communities flourish by removing barriers to dignity. And through my work, I've had the unique privilege of sitting with people, hearing their stories, and seeing up close the difficulties of marginalization. So when I read the story of Ruth, I admire her courage, but part of me thinks she had to have been at least a little naive to choose a life of marginalization. A life with no real options, a life of powerlessness, vulnerability, and dependence on the charity and generosity of others. A life whose only hope was found in the long shot, almost unrealistic prospect of a redeemer. And when you read Ruth 1, you can feel this in Naomi's plea to Ruth and Orpah to turn back to Moab. You can feel Naomi saying, who in Israel would be willing to redeem a Moabite if you come with me? So I want you to take just a moment this morning and feel the weight of Ruth's decision. This is what she chose out of hesed, loyal, covenantal love for her mother-in-law. And if you're like me, you've experienced the desperation of Ruth. Not the way Ruth might have as someone marginalized by society, but spiritually. Helpless because of my own sin and brokenness. Hopeless. Powerless. Vulnerable. Entirely dependent on the unimaginable grace of a Redeemer who, despite who I am, came to save me. The only requirement to belong here this morning is to confess your hope is found in the generosity, kindness, and unearned grace of Jesus, our Redeemer. You belong here if you know the desperation of Ruth and the grace of Jesus. We need to be a community that knows the desperation of Ruth. But we also need to be a community committed to living out the redemptive actions of Boaz. This second part of belonging is invitational. God invites us to make redemptive choices. In my doctoral research on critical thinking, I spent several years studying the process and criteria for making reasonable choices based on reliable evidence and predictable outcomes. When Naomi decided to return to Israel in Ruth chapter 1, and she explains her situation to her daughters-in-law, Orpah is the one who made the reasonable choice. In that culture, a woman's security was tied to her role as a wife and a mother. Orpah's choice to go back to Moab, remarry, rebuild her life among her own people was the reasonable choice with a predictable outcome. Ruth's choice made no sense at all. She chose uncertainty over stability. She chose risk over safety. She stepped into a life so vulnerable that Boaz has to reassure her in Ruth 2:9 and tell her he ordered his men not to touch her. Ruth doesn't go with Naomi because it's reasonable. She clings to her out of a deep love. And as I said earlier, given what I know about marginalization, my gut reaction is that Ruth had to have been a little naive or maybe even foolish to make that choice. Or consider this. When we turn away from God and choose to pursue our own interests over His, which I do multiple times a week, when we choose to take control of our lives instead of giving control to our Creator, the reasonable thing for God to do would be to let us go. But God did not make the reasonable choice. Instead, He pursues us who turn away from Him day after day. He sent His one and only Son to suffer and die for us so that we can be reconciled and restored to relationship with Him. I think this is what Paul is talking about in 1 Corinthians when he writes that the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing. That God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise, and that we should become fools so that we may become wise. Redemptive choices are often choices the world or people around us call foolish. And if I'm honest with myself, they may be even choices that deep down I believe are foolish too. So what are a few practical differences between a reasonable choice and a redemptive choice? This is a long text, so we're going to only read part of it out loud and together, but let's do that now. So we're going to start here. So please read with me. Then Boaz said to the Redeemer, Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, is selling the parcel of land that belongs to our relative Elimelech. So I thought I would tell you of it and say, buy it in the presence of those sitting here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not, tell me that I may know, for there is no one besides you to redeem it, and I come after you. And he said, I will redeem it. Then Boaz said, the day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance. Then the Redeemer said, I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption yourself, for I cannot redeem it. Now this was the custom in former times in Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging. To confirm a transaction, The one drew off his sandal and gave it to the other, and this was the manner of attesting in Israel. So when the Redeemer said to Boaz, "Buy it for yourself," he drew off his sandal. Then Boaz said to the elders and all the people, "You are witnesses this day that I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belongs to Elimelech and all that belongs to Chilion and Mahlon. Also Ruth the Moabite, the widow of Mahlon, I have bought to be my wife, to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brothers and from the gate of his native place. You are witnesses this day." On the surface, this scene in Ruth, like many of the scenes we've been looking at, probably seems strange to you. The cultural practice here doesn't quite fit into mainstream American individualistic culture, right? How odd that a man was expected to pay money to redeem someone else's land and marry someone else's widow, all to preserve a dead man's name and his connection to a piece of property. But one thing I've learned living cross-culturally over all those years is that when I run into something that feels really strange to me, I should stop, reflect, and ask, what's happening beneath the surface here? And Kathy and Matt and Heather have already done a good job of talking about this the last few weeks, but I want to give a quick refresher on the role of the kinsman redeemer, and I promise we'll get to what this has to do with us. So bear with me as we walk through this. The law of the kinsman redeemer outlined the responsibility a close relative had toward his kin, his extended family, and it included redeeming land, redeeming a relative out of slavery, pursuing justice for a murdered relative, receiving restitution on behalf of a wronged relative, and redeeming the family line through marriage. And in our story, Boaz fulfills two of these responsibilities for Naomi's husband, Elimelech, redeeming the family line and redeeming the family land. The Old Testament, when we talk about redemption of the land, makes it clear that people do not own land. God owns land. And then the Israelites were given the privilege of caring for God's land. But that privilege was conditional on faithfully keeping God's covenant. So if they broke God's trust, they lost this privilege, and this is a dynamic we see play out repeatedly in Scripture. And because of this, Israelite law prohibited permanently selling land outside the family. It wasn't theirs to sell. But if an Israelite fell into poverty, he could sell the use of the land that God entrusted to his family. And then every 50th year, the year of Jubilee, all the land was supposed to go back to its original caretakers, regardless of anyone's circumstances, and there were all sorts of laws around that as well. So losing the land through poverty or debt, or not having a son, was a kind of theological rupture. It was a breaking of what God intended, and that's why God established the kinsman redeemer. So the nearest relative could buy back the land and keep it within the family to repair this breach of God's intention. So this is the first part of what Boaz is doing. He's redeeming the land entrusted to Elimelech's family. The second part is redemption of the family line through marriage. It was called levirate marriage. A brother-in-law, or in this case, the closest relative, carried the responsibility to marry his deceased brother's childless widow. Try to say that 4 times fast, right? Both to preserve his relative's name and inheritance and to protect his widow. So levirate marriage only applied to women who did not have a son, because in that culture, if a woman had a son, he was her protection. So then if the kinsman redeemer had a son with his brother's or relative's widow, that son would in some sense take his dead father's place, take his dead father's inheritance and responsibilities, including protecting his mother, and in this case, grandmother. So we may not relate to the importance these cultures placed on land and lineage, or to the specific vulnerabilities that women faced at that time, But beneath the surface of the law of the kinsman redeemer, we see that God is committed to preserving his covenant, protecting vulnerable people, and providing justice. And in Isaiah, God repeatedly calls himself Israel's redeemer and uses the same Hebrew word, goel, as is used here. So the human law of kinsman redeemer was meant to be a lived out example of divine redemption. Finally, one of the most important things to understand is that the role of the kinsman redeemer was a privilege. It was not an obligation. So Israelite law built in acceptable ways to decline the role. The kinsman redeemer had every right to say no. All right, raise your hand if you're still with me. That's a lot of information. I get it. It's kind of hard to pull through. We got through that part. I know, it still seems kind of weird, right? So let's get back to our story with that background in place. So in this passage, we see that reasonable choices are safe, but redemptive choices are typically risky. I want to build a little on what Matt talked about last week. I see a difference between the kind of risk Boaz takes in chapter 4 and the risks we saw Ruth and Naomi take in chapter 3. In many ways, Ruth and Naomi took risks when they had little or nothing to lose. But Boaz, he took a risk when he had little or almost nothing to gain. If Boaz married Ruth and had only one son, everything he poured into that son, time, land, resources, would go to the line of Mahlon and Elimelech. And that's why we see Boaz brings the matter of Elimelech's land to the closer kinsman redeemer, and the man's first response is, of course, I'll buy the land. But the moment he realizes the land comes with an obligation that could threaten what he has and put his own inheritance at risk, he immediately backs out, and he says, I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair, put at risk, my own inheritance. Basically, he's not willing to give up what is safe for something that may come at a cost. So what are we willing to risk for a redemptive act? After church today, you have the opportunity to hear from Mark and Sue Davis, who we heard from just a little bit earlier. And I met Mark and Sue about 20 years ago in Bolingbrook, before either of us had any connection to Wellspring or the CMA. And they financially supported our family, and they were unique among our partners because they're always looking for ways to help beyond sending money. They were seeking out and ready to respond to redemptive opportunities. And when you hear their story, you'll learn that for 40 years, they offered their professional skills to God with open hands, and they asked one risky question for 40 years. God, where do you want us to worship you through our work? So when I heard they'd sold their home and moved to Mexico, I wasn't surprised. It was the same pattern I'd seen in them here for years before they ever moved. Now, I imagine that most everyone here this morning, for almost everyone here, risk probably won't look like moving overseas for most of you. But what might redemptive risk look like for you? Maybe it's a financial risk, like lending money you might not get back. Or a reputational risk, vouching for someone, or hiring someone others warned you not to hire. Maybe it's a relational risk, taking in someone whose situation is messy when helping them means absorbing their chaos into your own household. Or maybe it's something smaller, like defending someone's reputation when staying quiet would cost you nothing, or giving your time to someone when you have little margin. Reasonable choices are safe, but redemptive choices are typically risky. And through Boaz, we also see that reasonable choices focus on our good, but redemptive choices focus on the good of others. A reasonable choice typically asks, what is best for me and my people? A redemptive choice typically asks, what is best for them and those people? As Kathy pointed out, the first redemptive choice that Boaz made was simply noticing Ruth. He saw someone others overlooked and recognized her vulnerability. Instead of focusing on getting the most out of his harvest and his fields for him and his people, he made sure a vulnerable woman, a Moabite, was protected and cared for. And we see that same posture here in chapter 4 in the legal language that Boaz uses at the gate. He isn't securing his own name. He's making sure Mahlon's name isn't cut off. He says his marriage to Ruth is to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brothers. This whole transaction is designed for someone else's benefit, not his own. A few years ago, the president of our organization retired, and she gave me a call, and she personally asked me to apply for her position. So I applied, and the further I got into the process, the more I was really excited about the prospect of stepping into this new challenge. And after several months, I ended up as one of 2 finalists. And I can remember I was at a conference somewhere when the board chair called me and told me they'd offer the position to a younger woman with no connection to our organization and no long-term cross-cultural living experience. And it hurt. Rejection, anger, disappointment, questioning, all of it. I felt all of it. And not just in a moment. I felt all of it for a while. And a lot of the well-intentioned advice that I was given at that time was maybe it was time for me to move on. And honestly, everything in me wanted to leave the organization. But deep down, I felt God challenging me to stay, to support somebody I knew nothing about who had been given something I really wanted. So I stayed. I became her biggest advocate. It was challenging, heart-wrenching at times. But as a result, I ended up experiencing the incredible blessing of working alongside someone I am now so grateful to know, trust, and deeply respect. Focusing on the good of others can be as simple as giving someone else an opportunity you believe you deserve. Giving someone something you really want for yourself. Or genuinely, and this might be the hardest thing to do, genuinely celebrating someone else's accomplishment, even when it's the accomplishment you wished was yours. Boaz didn't calculate the cost of meeting someone's need. He saw the need, and at his own cost, he responded redemptively. Finally, reasonable choices fade, but redemptive choices endure. Do you notice that Orpah's choice to return home to Moab and the closer kinsman redeemer's choice to decline the land and marrying Ruth are never condemned? There is nothing negative said about their choice. And as I mentioned, the role of the kinsman redeemer was always a privilege, not an obligation. And hesed, redemptive love, by definition, must be freely given. Orpah and the closer kinsmen aren't condemned, but their stories just fade away. And one of the beautiful things we see in the book of Ruth is that the redemptive choices of Ruth and Boaz endure. God used their choices to bring an outsider into the line of Jesus the Messiah so that for eternity it would be clear that you and I belong. Before we wrap up, I want to clarify a few things. When you speak up here, I'm sure Pastor Mitch feels this all the time. You say these things, and you're always wondering, are people hearing it the way I mean? So just want to take a minute to clarify 2 things in case your mind's going away that I'm hoping it doesn't. First, I want to clarify that God doesn't judge us when we act reasonably. I am not saying that. Or even when we choose what is reasonable over what is redemptive. I often reflect on an interaction I've had, and I think, Dang. I totally could have responded redemptively there, and I didn't. And there are seasons in my life when I'm barely able to manage my own circumstances, and responding redemptively feels completely out of reach. And that's okay. Reasonable choices aren't bad or even unfaithful. Most of the choices that I make every day are reasonable, I hope. And I don't believe God wants us to beat ourselves up every time we pass up an opportunity to act redemptively. I want us to remember the opportunity to act redemptively is a privilege. When we pass up these opportunities, we may miss out on the chance to grow and the blessing of participating more fully in what God is doing in our world, but God's grace is enough. He can accomplish his plan with or without us. He invites us to make redemptive choices for our good because he loves us. The second thing I am not saying is I am not saying that the redemptive choice is always the hard choice and the reasonable choice is always the easy choice. Redemptive choices are often difficult, and usually they don't come naturally to us, but easy versus hard is an oversimplification. Both our move from the U.S. to Beirut and our move from Beirut to Wheaton, I believe, were redemptive choices. Christ's love compelled us to take a risk for the good of others with the hope of eternal impact each time, even though the world and even some believers might have labeled one, the hard choice, going to Beirut, and the other, the easy choice, moving to Wheaton. And in spiritual context, I really don't like the language of easy and hard, because I don't think God cares whether we make easy or hard choices. He cares about our hearts. He cares about our good. And he wants us to faithfully follow him moment by moment. That's what matters to God, not how easy or hard a choice is. Finally, I want to give a simple anatomy of a redemptive act that we see in the book of Ruth. I think this lays this out so well, so that together we can be on the lookout, ready, prepared when these opportunities arise. A redemptive act involves noticing what others ignore, asking with curiosity, listening carefully, inviting without hesitation, providing without expectation, and persevering to the end. So keeping this all in mind, I want you to ask yourself these questions this morning. Is there an opportunity in front of you right now where God might be asking you to choose the risky path, one that could cost you something, instead of the safe one? Is there an opportunity where God might be asking you to put someone else's good ahead of your own? Is there an opportunity that feels foolish to you at the gut level, but deep down you sense God challenging you to pursue it anyway? Is there a situation where you could do a better job of noticing, asking, listening, inviting, providing, or persevering? If the answer is yes to any of those, what blessing of participating more fully in what God is doing might you be missing if you pass up the redemptive choice? I said I was curious when Pastor Mitch invited me to preach in this series on belonging, because fostering belonging in the church is complicated. The church is supposed to be able to bring together Messianic Jews alongside Palestinian Christians, Russians alongside Ukrainians, Republicans alongside Democrats. And this might be the hardest one for all of you, even Bears fans alongside Packers fans. Fostering belonging needs to be able to overcome fear, mistrust, and misunderstanding, and go deeper than creating a place where people are nice to each other or where everyone feels appreciated. The church has to be a place where deep cultural, ideological, political, and even theological differences can be set aside so that together we can display the Hesed love of Jesus to the world. And that's a really tall order. But I started this message by talking about my own experience in Lebanon of never quite fitting in. And maybe that's how you feel this morning. Maybe you feel like you don't fit in. Here, at school, at work, at home, in your family. Or maybe you're trying so hard to belong that you're exhausted. In the world, belonging means being like other people or being liked by and accepted by other people. And honestly, if that's what we're trying to foster as a church, it's not a bad goal. But if that's what we're trying to do here, I think many of us will end up disappointed and disillusioned. But maybe what can actually draw us together is that shared feeling of desperation we experience when we don't fit in. Maybe this desperation is one of the many ways God reveals our need for him, the fact that we all, like Ruth, need a redeemer. And maybe, just maybe, if we can more fully embrace the desperation of Ruth and encourage one another to make redemptive choices like Boaz, together we'll create a place here at Wellspring where everyone belongs.